Yes. So, hello, my name is David Levi-Faur, and I welcome you here all for this event, which is a tribute to a dear colleague, excellent and prominent scholar, a leader in research, Christopher Hood, who passed away earlier this year. And we are here also with sorrow, but also with with a with sort of celebration of his work and our experience, our meeting with him during the years. For me, Christopher was a leader in research. His work on risk and regulation at the beginning of the 2000s in the context of car was amazing, but he had impact across the field of public administration, political science, and more generally the social sciences. So I will just serve here as a moderator for a discussion that will allow people who are very close to him to take part. Some of them are on the screen now. Others are in the audience. Many others are in the audience, and we hope to let all of them speak and comment during this, say, 60 to 90 minutes event. We'll start with Professor Colin Scott, at the time at the LSE, now in USD. And Colin, please start.
Thank you very much, David. I feel both honored and happy to be here participating in this event to remember the remarkable man and colleague and friend that Christopher Hood was, but also sharing that great sorrow at the person we've lost. I served a remarkable apprenticeship in terms of research and education actually with Christopher LSE. We first met in Helsinki at a conference in 1992, just after I'd been appointed to LSE. He was already there, but the typical LSE thing, that you meet your LSE colleague from a different department in a different country. Many LSE people will recognize that. And we immediately sort of hit it off with our curiosity about different and various aspects of the public sector and the state. And we all, I think, probably know something of the scholar Christopher Hood, curious, creative, invented all those remarkable new words and new terms that constantly pop up in his writing. Also incredibly ambitious and prolific for his scholarship. But I want to start by saying just something about the man, a kind and funny man, although also a very serious man. I remember working with our students at LSE, always deeply interested in, to be honest, interested in their learning and scholarship more than their personal details, but intensely interested in supporting them around their work. And we had a couple of PhD students we worked with together. He was also very kind to me. I remember when my father died, he was immediately on the phone to me to talk about when his father died, and with advice and support that was both comforting and useful. I mean, those of you know Christopher in his public life, you may not have expected him to be the person to pick up the phone to say, "I'm so sorry for your loss, and I want to talk to you a bit." I wondered whether he had some Irish roots. I've discovered since I moved to Ireland that the Irish are rather good at the ways of death and supporting people, and Christopher was very good at that actually, as well. I want to say something about, that all those qualities he had were reflected in the ambition we dreamed up together, along with our colleague Robert Baldwin, to establish a master's program in regulation. And given that the teaching he did is probably not so well known, I thought I might just say something about this. We came with this idea that we needed a course in regulation at LSE, And it's a difficult thing to do to get a course up between two departments, law in my case and politics, but actually we had five departments because we had geography and economics and geography on board too. And economics, the most remarkable, of course, with apologies to any economists on the call, getting economists to collaborate without proper incentivization, which we didn't have really, is always difficult. But Sir Tim Besley was game to teach with us. And I remember Christopher saying, well, Colin, you be the program director, and I will be, he said, I will be the chair of the exam board. And well, that was a relief. I didn't have to worry about the exam board, but I knew nothing about being a program director for a master's program at my early stage in career. But he and Rob Baldwin supported me, and we worked it through. And actually, we had a great group of people at LSE at that time. Mark Thatcher and then later Martin Lodge joined us. We had Judith Rees in geography and Stephen Glaister in geography, and of course Julia Black and Rob Baldwin in law, and Bridget Hotter, of course, who died a couple of years ago. She was also from sociology, and so we had great fun. It's the best teaching time of my life, working on that program, and I remember one time Christopher said he loved doing simulations and he loved doing competitions. He was really about learning outcomes before anyone talked about learning outcomes. And it just came to him that what's the outcome we want? How do we get to that? And it was never a matter of just pulling something off the shelf. It was always a matter of thinking through how do we get some challenge for our students? And I think he must have been self-taught around all this. But he was so inventive. And so one day we were doing a competition and we were having lunch before the class. And he said, oh, I'll follow you down. I'm going to get my hat. And he came down with this fantastically theatrical grey top hat. Some of the LSE folks may remember his grey top hat. And so because we were going to do a lottery. We were going to demonstrate how lotteries work. And so he had the grey top hat for the lottery. So teaching him was always fun. And of course, it reflected also his enthusiasm around interdisciplinarity. I don't want to too long. I just want to two more things. First is that his interest in teaching, he did translate, of course, into a few textbooks. Explaining economic policy reversals, I've always thought was a fantastic teaching tool. It wasn't a complex. It was deeply rooted in research, but it wasn't complex and made things quite straightforward for students. So it was a very good chapter on regulation. It was a good chapter on other aspects of economic policy as well. And of course, he and I and Rob Baldwin edited a reader on regulation, which combined socio-legal studies and politics. And it reflected his commitment to getting some of the learning out into classrooms. And I think he was probably quite impactful through particularly explaining economic policy reversals with teaching and learning. The last thing I want to say is about something about interdisciplinarity. So I'm a sort of lawyer, a recovering lawyer, a socio-legal person, and he was always interested in the sort of things that I brought. And over a couple of years, we probably built up some common language so we could work together, which is always the challenge of being interdisciplinary. I respected his interest in sort of questions of who benefits from things and the kind of things political science are interested in. He was always very interested in rules, of course, and steering of behaviors and enforcement and so on. We had very good conversations always about those things. But what was interesting to me, we did this big project on regulating the public sector with Oliver James, George Jones, and Tony Travers. And we knew we were interested in the bodies that were public bodies regulating public sector bodies, so audit institutions, ombudsman, and so on. And we measured them. That was real, Christopher, to measure everything, to work out how much fit's going on. We also did every interview we did, we sort of did an environmental assessment as well. How close was the office to the center of power? What good quality was it? We kind of give an assessment of where they were in the pecking order. That would be a typical Christopher thing to ask. Where in the pecking order is this agency? That adds to our knowledge alongside asking what they do and how they do it and so on. So public sector bodies regulating public sector bodies, yes. Public sector bodies regulating public and private bodies. So competition authorities, consumer bodies, environmental bodies, occupational health and safety. We were interested in that. But I said, well, what about the private bodies that regulate public sector bodies. So International Accounting Standards is an example of private regulation of public accounting. The Advertising Standards Authority in the UK, a private body, regulates the advertising of both public and private sector bodies. I remember one time seeing an adjudication on a complaint about the Department of Social Security trading as the benefits agency, and a full review of their advertising and so on. Christopher didn't really want to go there. The irony was, I was not that bothered by the formalism, saying it's got no legal mandate from the state. I wasn't bothered, but he was. So I went off on my own a bit to look at private regulation of the public sector subsequently. And it was interesting to me, but I suppose the explanation is he was so interested in the state and state machinery, and there was so much to do with that. He didn't need to go off and think about private power, although many political scientists, of course, have gone to think about private power. And also, I think, and I'd be interested in views on this as a question, I don't think he was that interested in the EU and international exercise of public power either. We did do a chapter in the book on regulation of the public sector on Eurocratic gamekeeping, as we called it. But he dispatched Oliver James and myself over to Brussels to do a lot of the interviews for that. I'm sorry Oliver's not on the line. We amused ourselves on that trip with all the reversals you have doing. I mean, if you're doing interviews in a trip in Brussels or wherever, you always have reversals and challenges, delays, people won't meet you, the interview was short, it was long, all the rest. And last thing I'll say is that Christopher always had every reason to be confident about every aspect of his professional life, such a consummate academic and scholar and leader, and yet sometimes his confidence wasn't always all it might be. I once realized my role, when you work with someone as creative and talented as Christopher, and to be honest, you're a bit of a journeyman yourself, you kind of wonder what your role is, but sometimes my role was just to supply a bit of confidence. And I'm sorry Oliver's not on the call, because he did a wicked Christopher impression on these trips, amusing ourselves in Brussels. He would shake his head and say, well, what if the next train doesn't come? What if they're not ready for us? What if we can't find the office? What if that little bit of anxiety sometimes, of course, was an underpinning of how he's so successful. Because he did worry about things. He worried about the people he worked with. He worried about would things be good enough? He worried, and it wasn't to say he was a big worrier, but there was a little bit, for those of you who like Winnie the Pooh and Christopher Robin, there was a little bit of Eeyore about Christopher, I think. I hope I don't do this service by saying that. Anyway, he was a man I loved working with. I miss him hugely. It's a sad day, but I'm glad we can gather and celebrate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. And I must say that looking to the past, this last 25 years, the bonds that you created with Christopher was very constructive to the future of the field as interdisciplinary field. You coming from law and he's from public administration, and of course Julia from the laws, and the people from economics, and Bridget from sociology. So this was very constructive and an effect beyond what we could see, say, at the time. So you made history. Thank you so much, Colin. I'd like to invite now Will Jennings. And Will was a student of Christopher. And thank you so much for joining us. And the floor is yours, Jennings. Floor is yours.
Thanks, David, and thank you for organising that. It's a great sort of privilege and honour, and I think many of the themes that Colin sort of picked up are very familiar, I think, to all of us. And I think I'll just use my time on the floor. I could go on for a very long time, but I'd like to give us the opportunity to speak, just to talk a little bit about, I suppose, my personal journey, but also how it interlinks with Christopher's, sort of intellectual agenda. And as I was sort of preparing my notes for this, I was reflecting just how interlinked a lot of the questions we asked, and in terms of my research and sort of what inspired me, but why we got on so well. And I think back to the first time I met Christopher, which I still remember distinctly to this day, which is in those red chairs in the coffee area of the senior dining room in LSE, where I'd gone to meet him to to talk about a possible PhD project. And it's funny how there are certain moments in your life you just remember. We sat there and I kind of threw a few ideas about him. And what I was interested in, I was studying a master's at York, which is one of Christopher's former institutions, and I'm sure one of the reasons why he sort of thought, oh, I'll meet this chap to talk about his project. And I had this idea inspired by a kind of question of why electorally smart politics, supposedly rational governments, and a prime minister at the top of their game would pursue this mad project, the Millennium Dome, which sort of, this is 1999, sort of, it was sort of all falling apart. And I think in hindsight, I look back and think, well, this was a sort of typical Christopher question, because it was sort of a counterintuitive case, a puzzle, why politicians and administrators weren't conforming to our sort of rational choice explanations, why there was something a little bit deeper. The fact that an appreciation of why bureaucracy really matters, that doing stuff is really hard in government. Those sort of things that at the time I thought were obvious, but they're very Christopher type questions for political science and public administration. And then also this idea that policy processes aren't linear and sequential. And also at the same time, that sort of dark humor. I think that's sort of dark, sort of wry humor, maybe not dark is the right word, about politicians pursuing projects with their detriment. And sort of, I think I said, we started in that moment, and in hindsight, I think, oh, this is why. But kind of 20 years afterwards, we would kind of continue to stay in touch and talk about theoretical questions, and why I think besides having quite different personalities in many ways, we meshed in that way because we shared that sort of common interest of puzzles and so forth. But of course, as you'd expect, Christopher instantly gave that project, and I still remember it now, much more novel and multi-layered perspective. So immediately said, well, think about these comparative cases. And anyone who's sat in a seminar with Christopher would know that people would present, and it wasn't always you, it would be someone else, and you'd see Christopher, the brain would be instantly whirring, and he'd either say, well, of course there's this case, and he'd come up with some obscure, empirical, fascinating case. And I was thinking about his sort of examples, that he'd bring up in journal articles and so forth, like his Trobriand cricket, these sort of strange cultural examples that would make a point perfectly. Or he would say, and of course, so-and-so wrote about this in 1925, and you really should have thought about this, and you feel instantly that you just hadn't addressed the literature. And he did that with my PhD, but he brought these three cases. And why didn't you look at the sort of the Canadian centennial and the American bicentennial? And so instantly I had 4 cases, and I look back and think that, and I was thinking just yesterday, well, that was the PhD that I wrote. So sort of there wasn't a sense in which I was told to write this thing, but it sort of just was there from that first meeting. And I think it speaks a lot to sort of Christopher's wisdom, that he was able to sort of just kind of help you see things in a way that others wouldn't, but not force it in a way. I think Colin's back. I think despite his absolute brilliance as a scholar, Christopher was incredibly humble and sort of very unaggressive and sort of in the way that he'd operate. And I think all of those who've operated in academia would recognize that's not necessarily a sort of standard operating procedure, especially for someone so smart and thoughtful. And so for me, I think that I was thinking, there are very few, I think, when I'd heard Christopher very sadly die, I thought I think barely anyone, I think, could have influenced my life in that way, in the sense of setting me on that journey. In some senses, if I'd met another, I might not have done a PhD, I wouldn't have certainly followed the same successful path. And I reflect that in my own supervision of PhD students, that sort of care that Christopher gave. And I thought that influence, although I've drifted off and done much more in the work of kind of elections and public opinion, that influence of Christopher remains, because I still think what government does matters, that sort of how citizens experience public policy really matters, and how it's really hard to deliver public goods and public services to citizens. And I think those are the sorts of issues that Christopher raised, and I think the current political moment, that sort of ungovernability, the sort of the incredible difficulties of governments coordinating, operating the machinery of government have never been more pertinent. And so in some sense, Christopher would take a very traditional style of scholarship and a sort of very, very grounded perspective on things that would remain incredibly pertinent and contemporary and relevant. And I think the skill, one of the skills that I think Christopher was notable for, was that he was able to identify sort of a zeitgeist in public administration or politics but not in a cynical way, that he would be 5 years ahead of everyone else and sort of saying, there is this thing that's coming around the corner, and we need to think systematically, theoretically, empirically, and Colin's quite right about measurement, about this thing. And because we all know that the lags and the timelines in academia are so slow, he would be on to the next thing before everyone else had caught up. And I think that sort of a remarkable sense of intuitive intelligence and brilliance that Christopher had. And just to say a few more words about kind of my experience with Christopher. So I came up with this PhD project. He said, well, of course I'm going to Oxford, and I thought, well, that's okay, I'll go to Oxford, really. So that is a sort of small life choice, and I followed him there. And I think back to the first year because I had a York Masters and not an Oxford Masters, I was told, well, I really had to take the courses because I wouldn't, the Oxford course is very important. But I had the great privilege in that first year of studying on the kind of module that Christopher ran with Christopher Religion, who sends his sort of regards today, on comparative government. And in that class, it was a remarkable setting in All Souls Library where two very, very different scholars, but very kind of, of very different traditions kind of shared their insights. Again, I don't think it's a coincidence that I know at least 4 of the people in that single class who are now chairs of political science. There could be others, and I sort of, I apologize to anyone I missed, but I think it was really that sort of sharp analytical sensibility about the study of comparative government and politics, which was so influential. Just I'll say a few more words and to complete. But I mean, I then after the PhD, and again, I think that experience that Colin had was the same. That going to supervision with Christopher was slightly nerve-wracking because he would ask you incredibly tough searching questions. It wasn't an intimidating sort of context, but he was very kind and supportive. But you would know that you were going to get asked tough questions about why you had done something, why you'd organized something in a particular way. And I do think that sort of training has stayed with me to this day, because that ability to think so carefully and rigorously about all the possibilities. And I always think about Christopher's love of his 2x2 and 3x3 tables. And I sort of reflect on that. And I think in the sense that was Christopher's way of working through ideas in a really systematic, careful way. And I think we all have our sort of, in academia, our coping mechanisms. And I think I've developed my own. But and what he was good in is he didn't try to make me a sort of cultural theory or grid group scholar. I think I occasionally went into a kind of a supervision. I would try and do that. And he would sort of not encourage me, actually. He wasn't trying to make lots of mini Christophers around the world. He was just trying to inspire you to be the best possible scholar. And that supervisory setting, I look back, I hope I carry on for my students, really. I think it was a very kind, supportive relationship, but it wasn't some trying to be over close or oversteer. You wouldn't go to the pub, it was about sort of going and being about what you cared about and asking questions. And I think it was, I look back and think it could have been a much more stressful time, a PhD, but actually because of the way he approached things in a very cool, careful, considered way, I think it was a really productive and environment that I don't think I've ever had that sort of training and mentorship since. And I'm not sure, I think I appreciated it at the time, but I think, in some ways the testament to it is actually appreciated 20 years later, which I think is sort of what sometimes is the best sort of education that you can have. So after the PhD, I had the good fortune, I'm sure, through the sort of Christopher's mentorship and support, to go and work at CAR in LSE and meet many of, the people I kind of see here today, and sort of, kind of great friends and scholars who I've sort of had the joy of interacting with. And through, as Colin said, through the walls of CAR, you could see Christopher's influence and sort of that LSE environment. Although at the time Mike Power and Bridget were leading CAR, the sort of the intellectual kind of legacy of Christopher, despite having moved to Oxford, was still there, and sort of his work with kind of Rob Baldwin and Henry Rothstein and Martin and others. And I at the time sort of drifted off to a little bit more work on sort of immigration administration. But as soon as the Olympics were awarded to London, I kind of came back to mega projects, which again was a very sort of Christopher thing, the sort of the recurring question of, why things go wrong in public policy, why people who are kind of supposedly rational struggle with these projects. And then just shortly after that, we went on to start working on blame. And I think, again, Christopher, despite his mentorship and support, we hadn't rushed to work together. And I sort of really respect that. I think there are some PhD supervisors who instantly think we're going to write a paper together. But with Christopher and I, it was sort of a matter of, having worked together over as sort of a supervisee and supervisor for 4 years, then to gone on about 7 years later, we started to work on a couple of papers on blame avoidance and taking kind of Christopher's frameworks and some of the work I've been doing as sort of quantitative methodologies and time series analysis to bring them together in a sort of novel way that sort of drew on Christopher's framework, but applied those sort of time series survival analysis methods. And I think a real testament, I think, to Christopher's sort of intellectual wisdom and curiosity was that, although he wasn't a quantitative researcher, although he was very interested in measurement, he was very comfortable with you sort of bringing different ideas to the table and saying, actually, well, we could do this. And I think it's a really I have a strong belief about research and quantitative methodologies is they're not methodologies, they're theoretical. So when I do time series analysis, it's about the theory of time that relates to government and public policy. And so we worked through that, and that was a great experience, sort of seeing actually someone who kind of mentored you, taught you, go through the publishing process. And I say to my PhD students, again, I think you can only learn about being an academic and trying to publish it's best to actually done alongside incredibly experienced people, seeing them experience exactly the same things you do as a junior scholar, the unreasonable reviewer, having to think carefully about how you respond to, awkward reviewers, not necessarily getting what you're saying. And I think that was the kind of a sort of the final bit of my sort of apprenticeship with Christopher. Colin called it an apprenticeship. I think I've always felt it was that way. And so just to sort of close, I mean, I think one can't really do testament to sort of the breadth and the depth of Christopher's career in a kind of a short talk. But I think for me, it will always be there. I do always think, even to the extent that my sort of survival of university life and bureaucracy is still a testament to the way I think about Christopher's examples around bureaucracy. Whenever I'm in a university meeting, I think of, like the papers he did on targets, or the sort of rational maniacs in his work with Gwyn Bevan, that you sort of think of when I try and explain to other academics how you survive the sort of bureaucratic madness of a university. I looked at Christopher's work for sort of day-to-day coping mechanism, because it sort of has that, if you step back from what you're doing and think, the reason I'm going through these bureaucratic processes is because I have to satisfy the needs of the institution, the institutional logic, the individuals there. And if I just sort of perform my role, it's okay. And I don't need to actually have the same, that anxiety. And I think it's that's sort of testament to sort of Christopher's humor, but his groundedness, that, he would do very, very theoretical, analytically sharp things, but in a way that would really bring it to sort of everyday life. So, I can, only kind of share my sadness, but also celebration of sort of the brilliance and that Christopher brought. And I think just as a reflection, Christopher's humbleness is sort of remarkable. There are so many kind of, like followers, or just kind of his work, and just kind of disciples of his work, in the sense that we're kind of all here because he was so brilliant and inspired so many people, but at the same time, not being someone who kind of, look for it. I think Christopher in many ways was sort of be kind of sort of surprised by kind of us coming together. I think pleased, but I think that's sort of remarkable testament to him as a person. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary.
today.
Thank you very much. It was very touching words, and I appreciate it very much. We'll have opportunity to hear also from other students later on and participant in this webinar. But now we move on to Ruth Dixon, Barbara Piotrowska, and Rozana Himaz. This is and thank you so much for joining us, all of you.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thanks, Barbara, for running the slides. That's fantastic. Wonderful to see everyone here today, and we're, well, delighted and honoured to have been invited to present this tribute to Christopher Hood today. Well, as we've heard, Christopher probably needs little introduction, and thank you, Colin and Will, for those amazing tributes that really set the scene for this talk. David asked us to consider Christopher's academic legacy, and that's what this talk will really be about, the work that Christopher did in Oxford over the past couple of decades. Well, as everyone here knows, Christopher was one of the most distinguished scholars of public administration of his generation. As we've heard, he had enormous influence on many aspects of the field. And all three of us presenting today, Rozana, Barbara, and myself, worked with Christopher at various times over the last 2 decades. And like everyone else, we were terribly sad to learn of his death. Next slide, please. And today we would like to honour his memory by describing some features or themes of his research, drawing examples from the 3 books on which we were each a co-author. When we started thinking about this seminar, we realised that we could identify 3 common themes in Christopher's research, and those are what we'll focus on today. And these themes are shown in the next slide. The first is scepticism of conventional narratives. The second is a long-term perspective. And the third is interdisciplinarity, which, as Colin very clearly mentioned, was a feature throughout Christopher's work. Barbara, Rozana, and I will each speak to one of those themes, illustrating it mainly from the project on which we each worked. Before that, I'll set the scene by giving an overview of Christopher's years in Oxford. Next slide, please. Of course, as we know, Christopher's career extended over many decades before he arrived in Oxford. He'd already influenced the field of executive government and public administration in many ways, as we've heard, including coining the term New Public Management in the 1990s. Christopher came to Oxford in 2001 to become Gladstone Professor of Government at All Souls College and at the Department of Politics and International Relations. His early years in Oxford were dominated by the ESRC's Public Services Programme, of which he was director. This was one of the largest research programmes funded by that research council. Almost 50 projects were funded all over the UK and indeed slightly beyond. I was employed in Oxford as part of Christopher's small research and administrative team, and I saw at first hand how much effort he put into communicating the results of the research projects to policymakers in the UK and beyond. And some of you on this call may remember that programme, which was a formative time for many scholars of public administration. Following his directorship of the programme, Christopher was keen to get back to his own research. Not that he had been unproductive during that time. For example, he wrote his well-known book, The Blame Game, but he had not been running his own individual research project. The first such was one funded by the Leverhulme Trust. It led to the publication in 2015 of the first book that we will discuss today, which won 2 major book prizes. At the end of the Public Services Programme, Christopher was also awarded an ESRC professorship. With this grant, he worked with Rozana on a study of fiscal cutbacks. That led to the publication in 2017 of the second book that we will look at today. Christopher, in fact, retired in 2014, but that didn't stop his research. He became a visiting professor at the Blavatnik School of Government, and he was the principal investigator on a major project on fiscal control in the UK. The results of that research were published as a book in 2023, which Barbara will speak about in this seminar. And that book too has been shortlisted for a significant book prize. You may have noticed that a theme runs through these 3 projects. The Public Services Programme began at a time when public sector spending was increasing, but it ended shortly after the financial crash and the start of a period of fiscal retrenchment and austerity. So doing more with less is a theme of all these 3 books. Now, having set the timeline of these research projects in context, we will now look at each of them in turn. Next slide. I will speak about the first project and also about the first theme, that is, skepticism of conventional narratives. The aim of this research was to revisit Christopher's work on new public management from the 1990s. We asked, whatever happened to the future of government? That is, what became of the new age of efficiency which this managerialist agenda was meant to lead to? So in 2010, we set about looking for actual evidence of what new public management had achieved over the past 30 years. There are 2 opposing conventional narratives of NPM. There are certainly NPM optimists, such as the World Bank and the IMF, who were sure that approaches such as performance targets, marketization, and competition would cut the costs and improve the quality of government. The UK was portrayed as the poster child of this approach, and other countries were encouraged to follow its lead. And there's still really an international industry pushing this agenda. Only this year, former Prime Minister Tony Blair said, "You should be able to have a state that is smaller, more strategic, and providing greater efficiency at lower cost. That is the holy grail of governing, which people have always aspired to." But you can also find a much more pessimistic strand. For example, Patrick Dunleavy just a few years ago wrote of the malign influence of new public management thinking on core civil service competencies, which he suggested had left the British state open to public sector failures and disasters along the lines of those described in the well-known book by Anthony King and Ivor Crewe, The Blunders of Our Governments. Next slide, please. So what did we find? Christopher was not inclined to assume that either the optimists or the pessimists were correct. We looked at a wide range of indicators of costs and quality of government over the 30-year period. In terms of working better, our results didn't clearly support either the optimists or the pessimists. For example, we sometimes hear that trust in politicians has fallen off a cliff. Well, if we look at the graph on the lower left of this slide, we see that actually people never really did trust politicians. The upper line, the orange line, is people who don't trust politicians to tell the truth. And it starts high and stays high from the 1980s onwards. Civil servants fare somewhat better. The right-hand graph shows that people trust civil servants to tell the truth more than they trust politicians. And indeed, this trust was even rising over this time since 1980. We also looked at many other metrics. The difficulty was to find ones that were reported consistently over a long period. For example, the numbers of formal complaints and judicial reviews rose quite sharply. That, of course, is difficult to interpret. It may be a decrease in the quality of government, or it could reflect increasing public expectations, or simply availability of routes of complaint. To build up an overall picture, we collected as many long-term metrics as we could find. And overall, we found that most quality indicators remained largely constant, unchanged over the period. Next slide, please. So what about costing less? Well, it wasn't straightforward to produce this graph of the cost of running the central UK government because of the various data breaks and reclassifications. But we managed to produce some relatively consistent series. We found that the cost of running government rose in real terms, that is, corrected for inflation, over the 3 decades that we studied. In particular, gross costs, the top line of this graph, rose steeply until they stopped being reported, but even net costs rose over the period. These increases were unexpected because if there's one thing that the optimists and the pessimists agree on, it's that NPM led to cost cutting in administration, and particularly in the early period when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. Nevertheless, during this early period, administration costs of central government rose not just in real terms, as shown here, but also relative to total public spending. That really was a surprise and required us to think what NPM was about. Here's a quote from a paper that we wrote in 2013. Even the country often claimed to be the originator of NPM, that is the UK, more than minimal adjustment to received views of NPM may be called for. And the final chapter of our book discusses a number of ways in which we might adjust our concepts of NPM. Could it have been more about rhetoric than substance? Or perhaps, and Will has touched on this, is reform simply much more difficult than governments imagine? It is, for example, possible to cut civil service numbers without cutting the civil service pay bill, if the grade mix changes, for example. It's also possible to cut the civil service pay bill without cutting overall running costs, of which it forms a considerable part, if those civil servants are replaced by more expensive consultants or other forms of spending. So overall, we found that this study made us rethink a number of assumptions. Next slide, please. Turning to the other 2 studies that we're covering today, we find evidence here too of what the sociologist of science Robert Merton called organised scepticism. This was manifested in a number of ways, and I will just pick out a few. First, Christopher made sure that we considered how meanings and definitions differ across contexts and times. We should not assume that a word is always used in the same way whenever we encounter it. And my co-speakers, I think, will be talking about some examples of this. Second, we should avoid making assumptions or projecting our own opinions onto the data. We asked officials, for example, who we interviewed, what success looks like to them. And finally, we should not expect that one explanation will fit all the data. Why, for example, did different episodes of fiscal squeeze lead to different political outcomes? Christopher emphasized across all his work, these projects and others, that we must take complexity and messy solutions into account. And this last concept touches on the work that Will mentioned on the cultural biases of organizations influenced by the anthropologist Mary Douglas, which Christopher considered to be among his most significant work. Christopher's 1998 book, The Art of the State, considers how organizational cultures map onto the characteristic strengths and weaknesses of government. The book explains how organizational culture is rarely stable, as the inherent contradictions of each cultural type build up and eventually result in a shift to a contrasting culture. As well as in that book, Christopher also discussed these topics more recently in an interview in 2021, to which I will give a link at the end. Now I shall hand over to Rozana, who will take us through the second theme that we will discuss today.
Thanks a lot, Ruth. So I'll focus on the second book and the second theme about how Christopher's work took a long-term view. And I'll illustrate what this meant to analysis and interpretation based on our book titled A Century of Fiscal Squeeze Politics. And this was published in 2017. Now, this book is a historical comparison of fiscal squeeze episodes in the UK from 1900 to 2015. So it's long-term in that we cover over 100 years, 115 years to be precise. Now, the book itself took us 5 years to write. And when we started in 2011, austerity was one of the top issues dominating the practice and analysis of politics and economics. And this was just after the 2008 financial crisis. Like most highly charged political terms, the word austerity was rarely defined, and it was rarely defined precisely, and it meant different things to different people. So Christopher coined the phrase fiscal squeeze, and we defined it as substantial effort and activity by governments to impose absolute or relative losses on at least some people. And this was done by either restraining public spending, raising taxes, or using a mixture of these two instruments. We used data on historical government spending and revenue, and we imposed careful thresholds to define the conceptual framework for evaluating fiscal squeezes. This framework was introduced first in an earlier book, earlier book chapter that I co-authored with Christopher in 2014. And this was a chapter of a book edited by Christopher, myself, and David Heald, who is with us today in this audience. So the framework that we developed in the 2014 book was applied in the 2017 book to define fiscal squeeze episodes in the UK over 100 years. A summary of that analysis is presented in the graph here. The solid line in the graph represents spending as a proportion of GDP, and the dashed line represents revenue as a proportion of GDP from 1900 to 2015. The grey, yellow, and green bars reflect the type of fiscal squeeze episode. Now, the grey bars reflect a hard fiscal squeeze, and that's where the spending cuts or tax rises were substantial, both as a percentage of GDP and in absolute terms. But the squeeze was soft if it was substantial only based on one of these measures, and those are the yellow bars. Now, what a long-term perspective helps us to see is how the government basically used different tools and different combinations of tools over time, and to what extent. So we notice, for example, that hard squeezes were common in the early part of the century, in the 1920s, 30s, and 60s. In the more recent decades, fiscal squeeze episodes are soft and they are long drawn. Another interesting thing that you notice if you look closely at this graph is that fiscal squeeze episodes are not rare. We seem to be having at least one every decade in the UK. And following this pattern, we can almost predict that another episode of austerity is just around the corner for us in the UK. And this is probably not unique to the UK. Next slide, please. Christopher had a way of bringing to life the images that I drew. So I'm an economist, and it was always interesting to see how his perspective just suddenly brought life to almost everything that I said and did. So he called these squeezes, he called the deep but short-lived approach of the episodes in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1960s, surgery without anesthetics. And the later ones in the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, the softer squeezes, where the pain is spread out over a long period, as those following a boiling frogs approach. Quite notable about our book was that the spine and the structure of the book was based on quantitative analysis of historical statistics. So as I said before, I'm an economist. But then Christopher went behind these numbers to explore the political choices and processes in play. So the quantitative classification of squeeze intensity was complemented by a qualitative analysis of squeeze intensity in terms of voter loss, political costs to incumbents, and state effort to develop and impose squeeze measures. The quantitative and qualitative measures were not always perfectly aligned in terms of intensity. And this helped us answer the puzzle of why voter punishment of governments following large fiscal adjustments seems so erratic. It seems erratic if you only look at large fiscal adjustments using quantitative data. But if you combine this with a qualitative measure or analysis of political loss, costs, and efforts, then the patterns of voter punishment or voters punishing incumbent governments in the aftermath of a squeeze, they seem less puzzling. Next slide, please. Now, this long-term perspective was also prevalent in Christopher's other works. For example, his book with Ruth took a 30-year perspective, allowing the capturing of the effects of reforms. And his perspective was also long-term in a different way, in that he drew from definitions and interpretations that spanned beyond the exact period of study. For example, in his book with Barbara and colleagues, the study period was from the 1990s to 2010, but he benchmarked changes over this period using evaluations dating from the 1960s. This longer timescale allowed to see which reforms were most consequential. And I think Will raise this point as well with regard to how he was supervised in terms of drawing from case studies that, that sort of lent to this long-term perspective. That's all from me. Next slide, please, Barbara.
So I will take over from Rozana now to introduce the last theme, which I think actually doesn't need any explaining, building on the reflections that we have just heard from Will and Colin and Rozana and Ruth. That is interdisciplinarity. Because anybody who has worked with Christopher or read Christopher's work has witnessed the fact that Christopher's work truly embraced interdisciplinarity. And I am mentioning here just a couple of disciplines that he was drawing on. So public administration, accounting, anthropology, psychology. I'm not going to list actually all of them because they also don't include law, which is a subject that Colin has raised. So Christopher based his work on basically all the social sciences and as well as humanities. And what I think was really striking is that it not only reflected his embrace of various methodologies, of various theories, but it involves his deep engagement with all of the ideas that he was presented with. So he didn't only just pay lip service to interdisciplinary, didn't only just include the key references from various ideas, from various disciplines. He was genuinely interested in trying to understand what they have to bring in on board in terms of understanding and in terms of methodological approach. And so what I'm going to do now in the next couple of minutes is show you a little bit of how this worked in the project on history of UK public expenditure control from 1993 to 2015, which was the project that Christopher led, but also included Ian McLean and Maya King also on this call. And it's a project that ended up and culminated with the publication of The Way the Money Goes in 2023. So the project and the book, what they do is they trace, as the topic suggests, UK public expenditure from 1993 to 2015, taking both a chronological approach and a more thematic approach to look at how the control of public spending changed and remained the same over this long 20-some years period. And one of the themes that we identify in the book is the idea of gaming of public spending. In particular, thinking about what happens if you define categories of spending that you then assign various, essentially numbers in a column to. In particular, if some types of spending are seen as maybe more desirable, ones that have a floor rather than a ceiling, those ones are going to attract spending. Then other categories, ones that have more of a ceiling, so you can spend up to a given amount, and encourage trying to categorize spending away from that category and might be seen as, in a gross kind of caricature as undesirable. And so the fact that you have these categories basically encourages reassigning spending into various buckets, if you will. And so how can we see interdisciplinarity in that theme? Well, we can see it both in terms of nomenclature, theory, and methods. So in terms of nomenclature, the topic of gaming spending is present in many different disciplines. It's present in public administration, it's present in accounting and economics. But the problem when trying to conduct a literature review on the topic is that every discipline calls it something slightly different. So it's referred to as gaming, it's referred to as creative accounting, creative classification, and I'm sure that there are many other terms that I'm forgetting right now and that Christopher was very well aware of. Now, after we found the right term and we managed to kind of take stock of what we know about gaming, we started thinking about the incentives caused by constraints and spending classification. And here, one of the lessons, and that is a more maybe theoretical insight, came from psychology, just thinking about gaming as a response to management by numbers. Basically thinking of gaming as a situation of a double bind when bureaucrats have to both deliver the services they promise to deliver, but they're also kind of constrained by numbers provided by the management. Now, as I mentioned, another way in which Christopher's work was interdisciplinary was in terms of the methodology that he has applied. And the methodology was always in service of the question. It was never just a tool for a tool itself or for showing off, your proficiency with a given tool. So when looking for gaming, we were often poring over lengthy account documents or reports, looking over archival documents, working for interviews to think about, where is the footnote that shows us evidence of gaming? How can we actually show that gaming took place? Because obviously it doesn't come with a label. It's something that you have to find. That you have to. It's always kind of hiding in a plain view a little bit. And so in this way, we have engaged in a lot of methodology that you could more associate with history or with accounting. Finally, when thinking about solutions to gaming, so what can be done to limit this reclassification of the same types of spending? Some of these solutions came from economics and might be familiar to political scientists. So this is ideas of delegation, rather reducing delegation, of monitoring and competition. But then other ideas for reducing the gaming come from anthropology. So here it's all about relying on dense social interaction and on togetherness to kind of understand the common purpose rather than trying to game the system. Trying to change the slide and it's being difficult. Okay, excellent. So let me just briefly show it to you on a more coherent example that is New Labour's sustainable investment rule. And so the idea of the rule was to keep the public sector debt at a stable and prudent level. So as you can see, this is more of the kind of ceiling idea rather than a floor idea. So spending no more than rather than spending no less than. So you can expect that debt will be one of these quote unquote less desirable categories, ones that you want to classify away from. And what that led to is thinking about, how can you, so we started thinking about what effects that would have for classification of items as counting towards public sector debt or not. And we thought that, it probably creates this incentive to think about spending through mechanisms that are not classified according to accounting standards as affecting public sector debt. And so example of that would be the Public Finance Initiative at the time of New Labour, as well as student loans. The classification of both of these tools has changed over time, but at the time of introduction and growth in them, they both didn't count towards public sector debt. And so if you look at the PFIs, so they were introduced under Conservatives, but truly embraced under New Labour, which also came up with or introduced the sustainable investment rule. And if you look at the graph on the right, it shows you the number of new PFI projects in each year. And what you can see here is that until the late 90s or mid 90s, the PFIs were there, but they weren't really a dominant way of spending. If you move kind of later on in time, over New Labour, they were embraced fully. There were a lot of new PFI projects every year. However, then the changes to the International Financial Reporting Standards in 2009 brought PFI debt onto the balance sheet, making it a kind of more obviously visible type of spending in terms of counting towards the public sector debt. And accordingly, if you look at the trends in use of PFIs kind of decreased after 2000 and 2010. Now, this type of interdisciplinarity was very much present also in the other projects, and in particular, the type of interdisciplinary approach to the methodology. So in a government that worked better and cost less, the principle of consilience was very present. And that's the idea of gathering evidence from wide range of sources and putting it together, even if it's hard to interpret or contradictory. It's trying to learn from all the sources. And another method that was developed in the book, which is quite pathbreaking, is developing ways to deal with data breaks and reclassifications. And I can very much appreciate how hard it is to do, because we had to do it again for the way the money goes. Now, in century of fiscal squeeze politics, again, Rozana and Christopher came up with innovative methodology, as Rozana has explained to us, to classify intensity of fiscal squeezes. And so again, this is learning on economics and politics, combining economics and politics. And that method has been described as pathbreaking, as in a review that was published in Governance. And finally, as Rozana has told us, the book has a quantitative spine, but that is accompanied by qualitative analysis. So again, It's thinking about how we can use the tools that we have from various disciplines to get at the question. And I think this is one of the features that I personally really associate with working with Christopher. It's all in the service of the question. It's not in the service of staying kind of bound by any disciplines or specific methods. So that's it from me. Over back to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Barbara and Rozana. So I shall just very briefly bring things up to date. Christopher's death was sad in so many ways, and one of them is that he was incredibly productive right up to this time, and he continued to apply these themes and methods in his most recent work. Last year, Christopher kindly invited me to collaborate with him on a chapter for a comparative volume on civil services around the world. And we were given the brief to take a long-term view of developments in the UK civil service since the end of World War II. And that covers a period when many civil services started to adopt their modern forms. And we drew on multiple sources of evidence, as we had in our previous work. And our chapter concluded by challenging established narratives of civil service decline. And I'll just read out this quote, which is an example of Christopher's inimitable writing style. The notion of the UK civil service as having enjoyed some sort of golden age of competence and respect in the early post-war period, before nosediving into a harsh and dystopian era of political chaos, mutual blaming, and vanishing respect, however beguiling, does not seem to fit with all the available evidence. Next slide, please. And so this slide, just for completeness, gives all of the books that we discussed, as well as that one that Rozana mentioned, edited by Rozana, Christopher, and David Heald. And there are two other references that you might find interesting. One is a paper based on Christopher's John Gauss Award lecture, which is a masterly account of government approaches to COVID, drawing on his work on the tools of government. And the other is an interview conducted in 2021 in Singapore, in which Christopher discusses aspects of his own academic philosophy, which I found very interesting. So for our last slide, next slide, please. We leave you with this photograph of Christopher, taken in his office in All Souls College. Our presentation has only touched on his immense academic legacy, and we gratefully remember him as an outstanding scholar, mentor, and friend. Now, we're happy to answer your questions, but we would also love to hear your own memories of Christopher, including perhaps on how he influenced your work. Thank you.
I know that Perry wants to speak. Thank you so much, Barbara, Rozana, and Ruth. It was extraordinary presentation. I'm sure that you will come in later on, but let's start with Perry. Let me bring you Perry 6, please.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Will, Barbara, Rozana, and Colin for moving and fascinating tributes. I just wanted to make a couple of scholarly remarks and then a personal one, really. It seems to me, I know this is a large claim for a scholar like Christopher, who wrote on so many subjects over so many decades. But I do think there is a single theme which runs through so much of his work. And Ruth touched on it briefly. I think it's the concept of control. The concept fascinated him in all sorts of ways. And it's not just treasury control of expenditure that interested him. I once had a conversation with him about why, years before, both he and I had turned to Mary Douglas, and he and I sat at the great lady's feet, but in very different circles, in the same period, in the 1990s. And he said to me, and suddenly an awful lot about his work made sense, that his real interest was revealed in the title of that article, Control in a Bureaucracy. What he saw in Douglas first was an account of varieties of types of control. And that was what got him interested in culture, that he saw it as a way of exploring what might explain variation in types of control and change over time in types of control, and perhaps a comparative tool. And many of his other studies that might not obviously be about control turn out to be. For example, that book on blame is what you do when control starts to trickle away. I wonder if I could mention one other book which was produced just as a spin-off really from the ESRC program. And as Ruth said, he'd sort of taken a dip in his own research, but not in everybody else's. And that's this one, Paradoxes of Modernization. I don't know if you can see it in focus, with that lovely Paul Klee painting on the front, which Helen Margetts chose. Christopher doesn't have a chapter of his own in there. We co-authored the introduction and the conclusion. But those two introductions and conclusions show all of Christopher's style, design, and approach. His understanding that paradoxes of modernization were paradoxes of control, and not just of failures of control, but varieties of failures of control, varieties of strategies of control which had unintended consequences, unanticipated consequences. In my own chapter for that book, Christopher really pushed me hard, and he was right to do so. He directed me to literature going back to the 19th century as only he could, and to a variety of kind of conceptual approaches. And what he did in that conclusion to the book was use all of that systematic case comparative approach that Will talked about to synthesize the whole book, everybody else's conclusions on completely, apparently randomly unselected cases into a common framework. Just a couple of points really of a personal kind, because Ruth asked, should we say something about our own experience of him? Well, he was incredibly generous to me over many years, really. His guidance was enormously important. He stood referee for me on job applications. Indeed, I wouldn't have got my last chair without him, let alone my fellowship at Edinburgh, for which I was hugely grateful, without the references that he wrote. But I also know, because his prose style was so distinctive, that very often the reviews I got from publications that I submitted were Christopher's. His reviews were always, as a referee, the toughest, but also the kindest, actually. Rarely did he just say, this can't be salvaged. He never said, this is how you should salvage it. What he said was, here's some suggestions about how you might get, to come back to that word again, greater control over what you're trying to do. One or two of the things that he gave me very tough R&Rs on, I've still not found a way to publish years on. And now in my aged and retired state, perhaps I'll be able to return to them. The other thing that could be exhausting about Christopher, and I once said this to him in front of a large crowd when I introduced him to give a paper of his at the Mary Douglas seminar, is he could be very annoying because he had read everything by everybody and remembered it and could quote the page numbers. And this gives me a nice segue to Barbara, Ruth, and Rozana's point about interdisciplinarity. One of the fields that wasn't listed on your list of disciplines that Christopher drew upon was normative political theory. And because we think of Christopher as a political scientist and a public administration scholar who drew upon anthropology, we tend to think of him as this great explainer, not a normative thinker. But Christopher was deeply read in political theory. And you can see that in Paradoxes of Modernization, because he's constantly engaging with what normative arguments can offer and why they might fail in various ways. But we ought to mention that he was a great scholar of Bentham's work. He knew Bentham's writings intimately. And yes, he could quote the page references from the originals. It wasn't that he admired Bentham. He knew precisely the unintended and unanticipated consequences of Benthamism. And he knew its trajectory over time and its influence. But that deep engagement with the British traditions, plural, of political thought gave him a set of perspectives on his approach to variety in forms and comparison, which I think was really unique. And it's kind of quiet in his writing. He doesn't pepper his works with references to normative political thinkers, but they are all there. Weber, obviously Machiavelli, but yes, I mean, he knows the liberal tradition as well, and it is all there. And much of his systematic thought about unanticipated and unintended consequences is his reaction to the limitations of normative political thought when you're trying to do explanatory work. And this was why he kept coming back to the concept of control and its limits, and why he also recognized in his relationship with me and with so many others the limits of trying to control us when writing reviews of our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate what you did now. Michael, Professor Michael Barzilai, do you want to join?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, I think this event has certainly served its purpose. So thanks for organizing it, and thanks for all the presentation. I've sometimes wondered, how would one, recap that career in a way that you could remember, as opposed to being just too much information. And all of you have done that. I particularly like the themes in the presentations, in the long-term perspective, and then interdisciplinarity and so forth. So I'm taking away a lot. Maybe I can give back something now. Well, just on the personal side, he's the guy that brought me to LSE, in effect. Oops, little problem with my computer.
Yeah, it's always from this side.
It wants to restart. So my first main encounter with him was over a coffee in the SDR before I came, and then in the he was on the panel. I think he took a bit of a risk with me, but a big risk with me, but it eventually paid off. I think one of my first enduring memories was from co-teaching with him, which I did from the beginning of the time at the LSE in 1995. And I remember maybe the fourth sentence of his introduction to the class we were teaching called Public Management Theory and Doctrine. And he said, public management is a very interesting intellectual field. And I remember staring at the heater and saying, in my 10 years at the Kennedy School, no one ever had said anything like that. So this is going to be different. And I think pretty much that's lived with me ever for the last 30 years. And I'm very thankful for that. Just a few specific things. I mean, I agree with everything that's said. I think I would add that he was a great synthesizer. I mean, it's basically implicit in everything everybody said, but we might as well bring it out as just another virtue of his scholarship. I think we were talking about it in terms of, for example, how well he could sum up other people's work and sum up a whole field, like in the handbook piece on public management, the word, the movement, and so on and so forth. But that was one of his great traits. I would compliment what Perry was saying about control. I think the words that's missing there is that he was always interested in complexity. I mean, above all, and I think the reason he sort of explored, visited, dived into, somewhat mastered so many fields was each one had a kind of a lever to get at complexity in a different way. So, I mean, if you contrast, for example, administrative analysis with the culture theory stuff in Art of the State, I mean, it doesn't sound like it's the same person, even though it was written within 10 years of one another. But it was all, to borrow Barbara's line, in service of understanding complexity. And he didn't mind, being a little bit eclectic to get there. And so I think the way he, essentially did his theorizing was a bit different than other people, because that's what his theorizing was in service of, trying to get insight into complexity so that we could deal with the complex world we are in. To me, that's perhaps the most important thing. I think that, not to go on forever, but the two works that were not mentioned that in some ways are my favorite works of his were Administrative Analysis, that textbook from, I don't know, 87 or something like that, 86, 87, and Administrative Argument. Again, the main thing they had in common was the first word of the title, because the intellectual approach to the subject was so different one from the next, but incredibly systematic in their own respects. Administrative Analysis, just an amazing textbook. And unfortunately, doesn't seem to have it doesn't seem to be up there with all the others. I think in there you see, what Perry was talking about bringing the normative into the discussion of the empirically complex. And essentially he did that by looking at implementation as a set of design questions, and trying to understand how processes within government bring about the resolution of those kinds of questions, even if they're not faced directly. So, and I guess I would say also, it essentially provides a framework that people can use to approach questions of implementation, particularly if it's regulation-like and the policy involves a lot of rules. And not very many people are really good at developing full, elaborate framework statements that answer, indefinite practical questions about a kind of practical matter in our field, and do it so systematically from, page 1 to the end. Administrative Argument has particularly influenced me. his willingness to talk about rhetoric and to use the concepts from rhetoric analytically to make sense of varieties and ideas. That's been enormously influential for me, and it's another book that probably would have been better if it didn't cost 40 pounds to get a copy of. I guess the last comment I would make is that, you know, if the practical question is, you know, how to have other people who didn't know Christopher experience Christopher-ness, I think the only thing is role modeling, you know, imitating by role modeling, which is essentially what he did, because, you know, you can't point to any one thing he did, but the guy, through his interactions, role model Christopher-ness, and there's no better kind of scholar to be than Christopher-ness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Anyone else wants to comment? Please just come in, because yeah, that's the way to do it. I see David L. Please.
Yeah, if nobody else is going to speak, let me come in. I first heard of Christopher in 1976 when he published Limits to Administration through a mutual friend who'd been a flatmate of Christopher's. I then taught with him in Glasgow in the 70s, in LSE in the 90s, and then started writing with him in the 2000s and 2010s. He was immensely influential upon my academic career and upon how I approached academic subjects, and also became a close personal friend. There are things I didn't learn about him until his funeral. Two of them were that he was beginning to learn Gaelic, and that he was an enthusiastic exponent of Scottish country dancing. Neither were things that I ever knew, despite extensive contacts during his life. I think one of the points I make about Christopher's career is he was a tragic loss to the University of Glasgow. Glasgow wouldn't promote him, so he went to Sydney. I remember teasing him within the last 10 years about the fact that Glasgow wouldn't promote me either, led me to some level of comfort, because if they wouldn't promote Christopher Hood, I shouldn't take the refusal of Glasgow to promote me to be too much of an insult. And I then went off to Aberdeen, spent 25 years in Aberdeen, often collaborating with him, and then came back to Glasgow 10 years ago. My final point is that I get thoroughly fed up by hearing from university management about how everybody should be world-class or world-leading. Christopher was genuinely world-leading. And so I remember telling a university principal that the only two people I've ever met who were world-leading, one of them was now dead. The other person was actually Christopher. So the only two people that I would ever put the attachment of world-leading to are Christopher and Anthony Hopwood, accounting professor at Oxford and London Business School. The point about Christopher and Anthony Hopwood is they had followers. So my definition of world leading is you have to be a world prominent scholar, but you also have to have your followers. And I proudly count myself as one of his followers.
Thank you so much, David. Nice to meet you. Anyone else?
Can I come in?
Yes, please, Colin.
Thanks.
This was Colin, right?
This is Charles.
Charles. Please, Charles.
I'm very moved by today's proceedings. I knew Christopher, particularly early on when he was at Glasgow, and I was and still am at Edinburgh. And I became profoundly influenced by, at that time, by this book, The Tools of Government, which I don't think anybody has mentioned. There's a subsequent edition in more recent years with Helen Margetts in the digital age and so on, which I think is maybe a bit superfluous. but it seemed to me that what he was doing in the tools of government was opening up new windows in a very creative, very imaginative, very interdisciplinary. I prefer the word polymathic to interdisciplinary because that's what he was. It wasn't as though he necessarily respected disciplines and disciplinary lines and was going over different fences, but he was polymathic in many ways. And what I learned from the tools of government and what I did, what I got from it was the quality of a mind that equated to some of my previous heroes among my teachers at Yale, particularly Carl Deutsch, and also in a very different way, Harold Lasswell, in that Christopher, in the tools of government, first of all, focused upon the role of information and communication as elements, very important elements in the way in which government works and other organizations as well. His model of receptors and effectors and so on is a set of models, and that resonated very well with what I'd picked up from Carl Deutsch in his equally path-breaking book, The Nerves of Government. I certainly am not terribly well read in the more recent books by Christopher, but I shall now try and make that up, having heard Ruth's and other colleagues' comments on all of that. But on a lighter side, I met Christopher in various ways over the years. When he was doing the risk stuff at LSE, I had a long conversation with him about risk and so on in the context of my later and more recent work in information policy and privacy and data protection and harms and risks in that area. And then subsequently, quite serendipitously, can't even say the word, quite by surprise, when we met at the City University in Hong Kong, where he had a period of being a visiting fellow, and I was there for a conference. And it was very good to meet Christopher in exotic places, including Granada in 2004, I think it was, when he was running a panel workshop in which I participated. And I recall him in Granada taking several of us on a long walk wearing an extraordinary wide-brimmed Australian-type hat. Somebody earlier mentioned top hats. I don't know what his whole repertoire was in terms of millinery, but there it was. So I have very fond memories of him, but also immensely respectful memories of what I learned from him and what he gave me so generously.
Thank you so much, Charles. Shall we take one more or two more commentaries? If not, then Ruth, I will ask you to conclude, please.
Thank you. Well, I was just going to mention picking up on what several people have said, including Will, about Christopher's occasional anxiety. I have never seen anybody of his seniority worry so much about meeting deadlines and, well, like grant-giving bodies require you to write up what you've done. He got very het up, I would say, about will the ESRC think this was a good project? Yes, of course they will. But no, he was really genuinely a humble person in those ways. He recognized his own worth, but he really was able to get across the fact that he was doing, well, in everything, he was doing the absolute best that he could. Well, that is really all that I can say. But thank you so much, everybody, for coming to this seminar and to see so many of you.
I join you, Ruth. I think it was a moving event, but also scholarly event. We remember the person, but also the scholarship that he did, and of course his example to follow. I don't know if we can reach the intensity, the productivity, the dedication that he had, but it's certainly an example to follow. So I'm grateful for all of you for taking part in that, and to all the speakers that spoke today. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your participation. This video will be on our YouTube channel. Please visit, distribute, and subscribe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.